This video is learning targets 4 through 6 of Unit 2 on chemical reactions. So what is a chemical reaction? Chemical reaction is an interaction between chemicals that causes them to change into different chemicals. Fairly straightforward. So if you'll look here, these chemical reactions have names. We're not going to go into the specific names. I'll let you have that next year. But you can see what's going on here. Red plus blue equals red-blue. This is a new chemical. Or you can say red-blue, take it apart, equals red plus blue. Notice you have one chemical and it's broken into two things. And so down here it's a little bit more complicated, but it's still the same idea. A chemical reaction takes one or two things and makes them into different things. It's very, very straightforward. Now, when we're dealing with chemicals in this class, we're going to be looking at them in several different ways. There are chemical formulas and there are structural formulas. A chemical formula is when a chemical or a molecule is written using symbols from the periodic table. And so this is an example of the chemical formula. Actually, all three of these are the same thing. They're all ATP. This chemical formula in particular is kind of unwieldy. It's big, lots of big numbers. And what these numbers mean, let's go over this quickly. Obviously, this is the atoms. Here's carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus. And these numbers here represent how many atoms of each one is necessary in order to make that particular molecule. Now, what we'll use a lot in here is structural formulas. A structure is like something that you can see, a 3D, like a building is a 3D object. You can write the word building, and that means something, but if you look at a building, that means something completely different. And so this is the structural 3D model of ATP, and this is a more 2D model, but still a structural layout of the molecule ATP. And this gives us a better understanding of how these molecules work, because a lot of times in biology, the shape of a molecule is very important as to how it will perform in living systems. In particular, well, and the shape of every molecule is important to how it's going to function in a living system. But in particular, when we start dealing with proteins, proteins have a specific shape, and that shape dictates their function. So that's something we'll be dealing with over the course of the year. Chemical formulas can also be written out like this, and this is the reaction for photosynthesis and aerobic respiration. You see a couple things here. You see this arrow in the middle. This arrow basically is saying when it reacts or when it's going to react, this is what happens, or as it reacts. And notice you have two sides. You have everything on the left of the reaction, and you have everything on the right of the reaction. Well, the things on the left of the reaction are called reactants. These are the things that are reacting. All right, reactants. And the things on the right are called products. These are the products of your reaction. Now I want you to notice something too. We talked about these little numbers here, but we haven't seen anything like this yet, these great big numbers. So let's look at that a little closer. Now, if we know that for photosynthesis, and again, please don't memorize this particular reaction yet. It will rear its head again. But for now, just look at this. The numbers are what I want you to pay attention to currently. And I know this requires energy, and then you have C6H12O6. Now, this is without the big numbers that were in the previous iteration of this. Now, what those big numbers show you is they have balanced this equation to make everything nice and balanced. Because why do we balance things? Well, matter is neither created or destroyed in a reaction. You can't just create oxygen out of thin air, out of nothing. It has to come from something. And so those numbers help us to demonstrate that. So where do we get those numbers from? We get those numbers from the number of atoms that are in each side. So let's just look at the carbon, for instance. Notice how on this side of the equation, there's only one carbon. Well, over here there are 6. Well, in order to go from 1 to 6, something's going to have to change. Well, 6 molecules of CO2 are going to be needed in order to do that. And so that big 6 to the left of CO2 represents the number of molecules that are needed in order to do that. Well, what does that do to our number of oxygens? Notice, now all of a sudden, if we have 6 molecules of CO2, well, I could write CO2 out 6 times, and you'd eventually get the idea that there are 12 molecules of oxygen. And if you add it to this one right here, there are 13. Well, how many do we have on the other side? We only have 8. And so we need to do something a little different in order to get this to work right. And so I could come over here and put a 6 here too. Now all of a sudden we have 12 and 13. Well, how can I fix this? If I put a 6 here, or not 12, what am I doing? Not adding correctly. 18 and 13. Now if I put a 6 here, that takes care of my 12 hydrogens. I now have, let's just total them all up. Carbons on each side, I have 6, and I have 6. Oxygens on each side, I have 18 and 18. And hydrogens on each side, I have 12 and I have 12. Now that is how you balance an equation. Didn't do a very good job explaining that, but you'll get some practice in class and it won't be that big of a deal. So let's move on. There are 2 basic kinds of chemistry that we're going to look at. There's inorganic chemistry and organic chemistry. Inorganic chemistry has to do with metals and gases. We'll deal with this some in our class because you do have trace metals in your body and you have other minerals in your body that are necessary for life that are considered inorganic. But most of the time we'll be spending our time talking about organic chemistry, which is essentially the chemistry of carbon. In biological science, this is the branch of chemistry that's dealing with the 4 classes of macromolecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. In this is organic chemistry. All of them have to do with carbon, carbohydrates, carbon, lipids, and proteins, and nucleic acids. All have to do with carbon. Carbon is very abundant molecule in your system. It is necessary for life, and we'll be dealing with that as we talk about biochemistry and organic chemistry in this class. CO2 is an example of an inorganic gas that has carbon in it. And so we don't normally think of CO2 as being an organic molecule, so there are some exceptions. But carbon is a very important molecule. Carbon can form many different structures. It's very versatile. 30% of an organism's biomass is made up of carbon. And again, it's important for those 4 classes of macromolecules that we mentioned earlier. We'll mention later. One thing I want to point out about CO2 is that CO2 is the source of carbon in all living things. How does that work out? Well, plants and other producers take CO2 and create glucose. We saw the equation earlier. And then other organisms break down that glucose and release CO2 back into the air. And that's this great cycle that's going on with carbon. And so all glucose, all energy that you take in was originally CO2 in the air, and a plant turned it into something that you can use. As I said, carbon exists in other forms. This on the left, there's graphite. It's like pencil lead. On the right there is diamond. Both of those are made up exclusively of carbon, and it just depends on how that's arranged to where one of them is a relatively weak compound, and the other one is or molecule, and the other one is extremely strong, one of the strongest substances on the Earth. It just has to do with how it's arranged. Well, notice carbon is tetravalent, meaning that it can share its outer electrons with four other molecules. It has four other spots that it can bond, and so you can see that here. Well, sometimes you have double bonds, so two of those bonds take that place, which is relatively strong. You can also have triple bonds, and this is going to change the way that a molecule works. You can see here, often this is a structural compound, and oftentimes we will use many of these in describing different biological compounds and molecules. So these black balls here are the carbon, and white is usually hydrogen, and the red is usually oxygen. And you can see this is just a standard glucose molecule. You can see all the different interactions. You can see the double bonds here, and how this does have a particular shape. And sometimes glucose will actually form a ring structure as well. Here's a hydrocarbon. A hydrocarbon is just a molecule that's made up of hydrogen and carbon. Hydrocarbons are an abundant source of energy in nature. They make up your cell membranes. They are extremely hydrophobic. What do we mean by hydrophobic? Hydrophobic means that it hates water as opposed to hydrophilic. So hydrophobic, like the word phobia, fears, hates water or fears water, versus hydrophilic, which is water loving, loves water. Examples of hydrocarbons are fossil fuels like oil. If you take an oil or gasoline and try to mix with water, it won't work because hydrocarbons are extremely hydrophobic. And here are some different hydrocarbons that are found in your cell membrane. They're called phospholipids, which we will talk more about later. And your phospholipids are actually both hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Now here's the molecule ATP, and ATP is the primary molecule in cells for energy transfer. Energy is stored up in its chemical bonds, specifically the bond between the second and third phosphate. And when this bond breaks, energy is released, and then that ADP, which is AD, the di means two phosphates, the ADP will go out and get more energy and get another phosphate and do the whole cycle again. Here's a structural model of that. You can see a little more clearly. As that third bond is broken, energy is released. That energy is used to do some sort of work inside your body, muscle contractions. There's lots of different things that we'll talk about this in depth as we go through this class. But you get the idea. And in order to remake ATP from ADP, energy is needed. And so this is a very simple molecule, or a very simple model of how this works. And so when you go to lunch and you eat whatever, eat a candy bar or whatever, you're getting all of this glucose and different stuff. And let's just take glucose for instance. Well, a plant made that glucose using the energy of the sun, which is just energy that comes from outer space, from the sun. The sun is basically limitless energy as far as we're concerned. Well, in order for you to get that energy out, your body has to break that glucose and break those chemical bonds like we talked about earlier. And when it does that, that energy from those chemical bonds is released into an ATP molecule. And so that's the step here. That's that's the step here where when your body eats that glucose, it attaches a phosphate onto that ADP and it makes ATP. Well, that ATP can go out and do something. It can go do some sort of work and it becomes ADP again. And you need more energy in order to put the phosphate back on. And that cycle continues. And that's how your body is able to continue to do work. That's how all living organisms are able to do work. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about how those interactions work.